Okay, today's topic is really bizarre. It's one of the most unusual chapters in this long history of the Jewish people. It's the story of the massive 8th century conversion of entire kingdom, Khazaria, to Judaism. Wow. So why did they become Jewish? What happened to them? You know, it's a really an amazing story. If you look at this first slide here, you see the green area is roughly the range of Khazarian influence. It's a massive region in the area of what would be called, let's say, Ukraine, a good chunk of Russia, the Caucasus mountain regions, Georgia, Azerbaijan, places like that. And this region was Jewish for about 500 years. Wow, how did that happen? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Let's look at it in a little more detail. So, first of all, perhaps you have come across the story of the Khazars through this book, the Sefer HaKuzari, written by the great Spanish Jewish poet Yehuda Halevi. This is a 12th century work that is quite a bit later than the actual conversion of the Khazars, which is dated to the year 740, but it essentially tells the story of why this King Bulan of Khazaria converted to Judaism. Now, what's really important to understand about this, though, is that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was not trying to write a history book. This is a work of Jewish philosophy. If you want, it's a work of comparative religion. It's not intended to be an accurate historical account of the conversion. The story goes like this, as presented in the Kuzari, but basically, it's, you know, in brief, it really is what happened. This King Bulan, a pagan living in his capital of Itil, which is on the northern part of the Caspian Sea, he wonders about, you know, what is religious verity, and he decides he's going to hear from all of the great monotheistic faiths. He feels like it's time for himself and his people to move on from paganism, and clearly monotheism is a burgeoning trend, and therefore he says, okay, let's find out about, you know, what's going on with the monotheistic faiths. He calls for a debate between the three great Western faiths, that is Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and he has all of the figures discuss the historical elements of their faith, and ultimately, after he hears all of them, he decides that Judaism makes the most sense, and he converts himself, and his entire nation follows him into Judaism. That's the basic story as presented in the Kuzari. Now, why Rabbi Yehuda Halevi wrote it, and he could only write it really within the very special environment of Spain, which had large Muslim and Christian populations, was to give Jews an opportunity to defend their faith against the arguments of the other two great monotheistic faiths. And by couching it within a historical fact, the conversion of the Khazars to Judaism, he was able to present this rather challenging theological debate within a historical format, but really his main goal was to present the truth of Judaism vis-a-vis its competitors for people's allegiance. So we can't look at the Kuzari as a historical document. It is a work of phenomenal Jewish philosophy, but nevertheless, the basic story is really the core of what happened. But let's go into a little more detail into that. So here's a map of the entire region that you can see that the city of Itil right there on the north of the Kaspisches Meer, which is the Caspian Sea. This happens to be a German document. And they really extend quite far. If you can see up towards the top left, you see Kiev, which according to the great Ukrainianist Omelian Pritsak of Harvard, the late Ukrainianist, he believes that Kiev was actually a Jewish outpost of the Khazars, which is fascinating to think that, you know, the central city of the entire Eastern European civilizations of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, what's called the mother of all Russian cities, so to speak, was actually a Jewish trading post to begin with. But nevertheless, you see it goes all the way from Ukraine, right across much of the Don region in Russia, and well into Central Asia. So what exactly happened? We know a little bit more from a 10th century document that was written also in Spain, or it comes to us from Spain. This is a beautiful view of the Alhambra, a very important Spanish palace that many believe was actually constructed by Jewish figures at the time. We'll talk more about that in a later class. The great Jewish diplomat Chasdai ibn Shaprut, conducted sort of a survey of major Jewish communities throughout the world, and he sent a request out to Khazaria, and he received 2 responses from a King Joseph, who in fact told the whole story of how Khazaria became Jewish in the year 740, and in fact, this is really the basis for Yehuda Halevi's story. There are a lot of additional details there, but the kernel of the story is, this King Bulan had this 3-way dialogue with Jews, Muslims, and Christians, and in fact, ultimately decided to become Jewish. So we have multiple sources that point to the same story of the original conversion of the Khazars. But really, one more really important fact. Here's we have some evidence from the Cairo Geniza, which is quite fascinating. The Cairo Geniza is a topic that I wish we could have a lot more time to talk about, but basically this is one of the most important sources for Jews in the medieval period in the Muslim world, and in fact it's a really important source for Muslim history as well. According to traditional Jewish law, any document that has one of the 7 names of God that have special holiness may not be destroyed. You can't just throw away, for example, a Torah scroll, chas v'shalom, or a prayer book, or anything like that cannot be thrown away. And so the halacha is, then and now, that these things are stored in a special storage area called a Geniza, which means basically a storeroom or a treasure house, someplace where you put things that are important. And then from time to time they're taken out and they are buried in a Jewish cemetery. It happened that in the town of Fostat, not far from Cairo, there was this ancient, or this very old synagogue built in the 9th century that they had this custom there that anything written in Hebrew, regardless of whether or not it had sanctity, was stored in the attic, which is shown here in this kind of artistic representation of it in the Ben Ezra synagogue there, where they stuffed away all these documents, and not only holy documents, including autographs of Maimonides himself and all kinds of other really famous works, but they included marriage contracts, ketubot, business contracts, doodles, shopping lists, like, honey, would you please pick up some baba ganoush on the way home from the shuk? All these kinds of documents were stored in the Cairo Geniza. And then at some point, probably in the 12th or 13th century, it was sealed up, and it remained sealed until the 19th century, when it was opened up and people found about 250,000 documents related to about 500 years of Mediterranean history. This compares, by the way, with about 100,000 documents for all of Arabic history. So it's a phenomenal treasure trove of information. Now, we're going to go and talk specifically about what does the Cairo Geniza say about the Khazars, because, of course, it overlaps with that period. And one of the most fascinating documents is this one here, the Kievan letter, which, it has some pieces are missing, and it's difficult to make out certain letters, but many scholars, including the previously mentioned Omelian Pritzak and Norman Golb, who wrote a book on this document, argue that it comes from Khazarian Jews from Kiev, probably in the 11th century, and essentially it is a document that is called a te'udah in modern Hebrew, or a certificate. The document says, the bearer of this document is a fine, upstanding man, and he needs your support, so please, give him, be generous with him. And essentially, we still have these documents today. If you live, for example, in any Jewish community, and you live in a single family dwelling on the street, you will get charity collectors knocking on your door and presenting you with letters, something like this. Usually they're laminated, and they usually have signatures from the people of the community that say, this person deserves your support. He has 17 children. He has to marry them off. He has this. He supports a yeshiva. He does whatever it is. And so this is essentially 1,000 years ago, they were doing exactly the same thing with these kinds of documents. What's interesting when you analyze this particular document, though, is you look in the bottom left there, you see something written in Turkic runes. Not written in Hebrew, but written in Turkic, which was the language of the Khazars, and it is translated as the phrase, "I have read it." Now, Golb and Pritsak argue that what this means is that this document was obviously written by a professional scribe who knew Hebrew and who would put together the document, and then the officials of Kiev would sign it, indicating, yes, they approve, the contents are true, including officials who could not even sign their name in Hebrew. When it says, "I have read it," it means probably someone read it and translated it to him in Turkic, which indicates a low level of Jewish literacy. If the heads of the community cannot even manage a basic Hebrew letter, what was the content of their Judaism? And so that opens up all kinds of questions about the Khazars' conversion, which we'll turn to right now. So what were the prime reasons for it? Probably the most basic reason for the Khazar conversion was the fact that they had geopolitical questions to deal with. We saw this map earlier when we looked at the spread of Islam. I've added this kind of yellow region that says Khazar influence. But when you look at this, you see, okay, Islam is rushing up into the Khazarian region from the south. Islam is an up-and-coming faith. It's expanding with tremendous rapidity. And the Khazars, who are pagans, are saying, oh my gosh, we could easily be swallowed up in the in the Muslim expansiveness. At the same time, not really shown here in this map, but I kind of like the colors of it, Christianity is spreading from the west. Christianity has already taken over much of the northern bank of the Mediterranean Sea, and it is steadily making its way into what would later be Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, Russia, and so on. And so the argument is that King Bulan realized, wait a second, if we succumb to Muslim pressures, then we will lose our religious identity, and along with that, we will lose a considerable amount of our political independence. Furthermore, we'll be a borderland region, and we will end up being on the front lines with the spread of Christianity. Similarly, if we were to elect to become Christians, then ultimately we would fall within their geopolitical orbit, and then we would become a borderland to the Muslims, and we would potentially have a political and military dispute with them as well. But Bulan realized that, in fact, both the Christians and the Muslims regarded Jews as a sort of privileged, protected people. The Muslims through the Pact of Umar, the Christians through the Doctrine of Witness, and therefore he said, wait a second, what if we take a moderate approach and we become Jews? Then Muslims will have to, respect our political integrity, at least to some degree, Christians as well, and we can retain our identity within the context of the spread of these other two great monotheistic faiths. V'kach, that seems to be what he decided, and in fact the Khazars did maintain their independence as a Jewish nation for about 500 years as a result. Still, we have lots of other questions like, wow, they became Jewish? I mean, what happened? Why did they become Jewish besides the geopolitical? How Jewish were they? How come we don't hear anything more about them? I mean, these are all really big questions. So let's look at those right now. So there's evidence from medieval travelers that, in fact, the level of their Jewish commitment was fairly thin. Travelers like Benjamin of Tudela, Petachi of Regensburg, talk about the Khazars, and they don't seem to have a lot to say about them. It doesn't seem to really excite their attention that there is this huge Khazar kingdom. Not to mention the Gaonic responsa that has survived from Babylon, which is not so far from Khazaria. We don't have too much reference to the Khazars. They don't seem to be really on the radar of the rest of the Jewish world, so much so that we really only hear about them in the 10th century with Chasdai ibn Shaprut. There's some significant question that maybe they didn't practice very basic rituals like circumcision, and that's like one of the most fundamental Jewish rituals. As Jews become assimilated, it's one of the very last rituals to go. Perhaps they were Karaites. Perhaps they practiced a form of Jewish expression that denied the validity of the oral Torah. That's also a possibility. It's kind of lost in the dark. And it's very difficult for us to determine this from the archaeological record. If you see, for example, this coin from early Khazaria, it looks like a Jewish symbol, but the fact is the Star of David wasn't a Jewish symbol for many, many hundreds of years later. So it's hard to really understand what kind of Judaism they practiced, but the bottom line is they probably were not practicing full rabbinic Judaism as other peoples were. Many scholars feel that perhaps the reality of the Khazar environment was such that only the top layer of society, the royalty, for example, converted to Judaism, and the rest of the population just maintained a nominal kind of attachment to Judaism. All these things are possible as we understand the degree of conversion of the Khazars. Now, what happened to them? So this is kind of an interesting topic that many scholars look at today. Perhaps the most significant argument that really stirs the pot over the Khazars is expressed in this book by the famous author Arthur Kessler, called The 13th Tribe, in which he argues, along with several other scholars, that the Khazars, when they disappeared, they essentially formed the ethnic basis for Eastern European Jewry, known as Ashkenazic Jewry. Most scholars dispute this theory, and in fact they impute less than ideal motivation to those who advance this proposition. But just in brief, why would you argue that the Khazars became Ashkenazi Jewry? Well, because you've got this massive population, and where do they go? I mean, what happens to them? That's the central argument, really, is where do all these Khazars go? We know that they're there until the 13th century, and then all of a sudden they disappear. The problem is there's very little evidence to indicate that the Khazars had any impact on Eastern European Jewry culturally, so it's hard to see any Khazar influence on these people. And at the same time, there's lots of evidence to indicate that Rhineland Jewish civilization, which is the heartland of Ashkenazi Jewry, the word Ashkenaz is associated with the northern German region of Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. There you see lots of evidence, like, for example, linguistic evidence. Why is it that we have no appreciable impact of Turkish or Turkic language on the language of the Jews of Eastern Europe, who spoke overwhelmingly Yiddish as their mother tongue? Yiddish is basically medieval German, so they carried the language with them from medieval Germany into Eastern Europe and Poland and Russia, Ukraine, places like that. And there's a lot of Slavic influence, Russian language and Polish language, Ukrainian language, Belarusian, but very little Turkic. One of the great scholars of the Yiddish language, Max Weinreich, does argue that there may be a few key terms, like, for example, the very popular Yiddish term daven, which means to pray. That does not have a clear Hebraic root, nor Aramaic, nor German. It may be related to a Ukrainian term, a Slavic term, but it's also possible that it comes from a Turkic root. So it's not saying that the influence of the Khazars is completely missing, but there's so little and such tangential evidence that people argue that it's simply not real. More likely, the preponderance of scholarly opinion is that the Khazars had such a thin attachment to Judaism to begin with that in the 13th century they simply abandoned Judaism altogether and assimilated to various indigenous faiths, presumably Christianity eventually, and so on. Now, so what are the perhaps inappropriate scholarly motivations of people who want to argue for this? Some say that the reason why people produce this particular argument is because it undermines the Jewish claim to antiquity through the Middle East in particular. In other words, if Ashkenazic Jewry are really descended primarily from the Khazars, that means they are not ethnically related to the ancient Hebrews of Israel, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so on. And this would mean that they have less legitimacy, as the argument goes, to the land of Israel, and so on. That's perhaps the political motivation for this kind of argument, which is incidentally very much favored by white supremacists and other groups. Not well supported by the scholarship, but nevertheless, one can see why they would want to argue this particular point. That being said, looking at the Jewish people as a whole, if you want to try and look at genetic background, it's clear that Jews are completely mixed in with whatever peoples they live with. If you look at the Jews of India, they look like the non-Jews of India. If you want to look at the Jews of Poland, they look like the non-Jews of Poland. The Jews of Ethiopia look like the non-Jews of Ethiopia, and so on. So it's really a specious argument. Judaism does not define itself by genetic origins. It is fundamentally a peoplehood defined by the Torah and faith. Nevertheless, let's go on past this. So what about the Khazar legacy? So besides the possible intrusion of the love for Chinese food that affects the Jewish people, see, that's why I put this picture here, it's very difficult to determine the specifics of how the Khazars made a larger impact on Judaism. However, it's very clear that they are well integrated into the medieval non-Jewish environment of the time. We have multiple data points that argue that, in fact, the Khazars existed. Many other peoples are aware of them. We have them in Arabic historians, for example. But perhaps the most interesting legacy of the Khazars is in Russian culture. The very important early document that describes the birth of Russia as a culture is called the Povest Vremeniach Let, or the Chronicle of Bygone Years. And in the central story of the Povest is the transformation of pagan Russia into a Christian community. And amazingly, although this document is written many centuries after the Khazar conversion, it's almost identical to the Khazar story. The king Vladimir, in the year 988, holds a debate among four practitioners of various faiths. In this case, he's having Jews from Khazaria, explicitly mentioned Jews from Khazaria, discuss Judaism. A Muslim discusses Islam, and two forms of Christianity are represented, both Western Christianity, later called Roman Catholicism, and Eastern Christianity, the Orthodox Christian interpretation. They all debate, and Volodymyr actually comes very close to converting to Judaism. Can you imagine what would Russian history be like if, in fact, he adopted Judaism? But at the last minute, he says to the Jews from Khazaria, he says, "Okay, let's wrap it up. I want to become Jewish. Where do I sign up? But before we do, just tell me, where's your homeland?" And the Khazars say, "Oh, sadly, Israel was our homeland, but it was taken away from us because of our many sins." And Volodymyr says, "What? You guys live in exile? Forget it. I don't want that to happen to me." And so therefore he turns away from Judaism. He also comes very close to Islam, but in a rather humorous moment, he sort of says to the Muslim, he says, "Okay, great. Islam, that's the way to go. Sign me up. Let's first drink a l'chaim." And the Muslim says, "Wait a second, you have to realize that in Islam, we don't drink alcohol." And he says, "What? Are you kidding? We Russians love our little cups," which means, shot glasses. There's no way we're becoming Islamic, and as a result, he turns away from Islam. Then the debate comes down to the Roman Christian, the Roman Catholic Christian, and the Orthodox. He ultimately, of course, chooses the Orthodox, and in 988, there is a mass baptism in the Dnieper River, and ultimately, Kiev and later its successor civilizations in Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia become Orthodox Christians. So that's perhaps the most interesting legacy of the Khazars in the non-Jewish world. Okay, a fascinating and unusual chapter in Jewish history, but it's time to move on. Thank you for listening.